Welcome to our online community that are joined by YouTube. We're thrilled to have this kind of hybrid model and to welcome our special guests. And I'll have Ray introduce in just a second, but I'd like to start with prayer. The Lord be with you. Let's pray. Eternal God, in whose perfect kingdom no sword is drawn but the sword of righteousness, no strength known but the strength of love. So mightily spread abroad your Spirit, that all peoples may be gathered under the banner of the Prince of Peace, as children of one God, to whom be dominion and glory now and forever. Amen. For those of you who are interested in questions, asking questions towards the end, Elizabeth will have the mic in the back. Thank you. Ray.
Thanks. Let me start with a very, very simple question. What's the highest? Oh, I should know better, but there we go. What's the highest imperative for a state? What motivates states to do the things they do? Is it a rigorous realism about themselves and others? Is it a set of values that they are trying to match that motivates the individuals who act in the name of a state? Or kind of a constantly shifting mix of the two? Various American men at various times are said to have looked at the various bad men running countries in the rest of the hemisphere and remarked, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. In the 1950s, American intelligence agencies supported, aided the overthrow of legitimately elected governments. In the 1960s, a fake military encounter off the coast of Vietnam was part of the pretext for war. In the 1970s, an American leader gave the instructions to make another country's economy scream. Leaders have been killed or disappeared. The decision to send help in various crises held up by weeks or months. Many of us in this room have had 3 shots to prevent a bad case of the coronavirus, while doctors and nurses in many places in the world have scrambled to get 1 shot or are waiting for vaccines to arrive at all. None of this stuff is simple. But moral questions are shot through the things that states and people do. We lurch in between care and worry for others that's sometimes dismissed as soft-headed and sentimental, to realism. Always watch out when that word is used. Realism that can go way beyond callous to something more like evil. So how do you strike a balance? To answer that question, I'm joined by one of the best people to ask. David Ignatius, longtime chronicler and observer of American foreign policy, novelist, librettist, polymath, and importantly for this conversation, churchman. Thanks for being willing to take on such a simple and straightforward question. What's a moral foreign policy?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that it's a struggle, like anything moral, discerning what the good is and then figuring out how to do it takes reflection and involves making mistakes. I thought, Ray, that I would just begin my own reflections on this question of morality and foreign policy by remembering what I felt in August, watching the television footage of people fleeing Afghanistan. There were some horrifying images, also some really inspiring images of people being able to leave. And I felt relief, as I'm sure everyone in this church and in our country did, that this long war, 20-year war, was ending. But I felt something approaching shame about the people we were leaving behind. Women in Afghanistan who had believed in a freer world that we had promoted. My own friends in Afghanistan, I visited that country probably 15 or 20 times over the course of this war. So as I think about morality and foreign policy, I think the first thing I think about is be careful what you start, because the way that you end it and the people that you abandon as you end it can be part of the tragedy. I remember a Saudi friend saying to me in a group, 2010, 11, I hope you Americans will be as careful about how you get out of Iraq as you were reckless about how you got in. And I think in retrospect, there's no question that that recklessness was immensely destructive. But the getting out is complicated. The getting out in a way that you keep faith with people, keep faith with your values. I'll just mention one other thing, Ray, as we're getting started. It's easy to, especially after what we've lived through for 20 years, to identify morality in foreign policy with not intervening in the problems of other countries. But I think of my visit to Hong Kong last year, being in the streets with all these kids, you know, getting tear gassed, and hearing thousands of young Chinese say, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong," and feeling that we had to be really careful about how we responded to that. That on the one hand, our values tell us to support young people who dream of freedom, of having a life with the values that we cherish, but that we need to be careful about implying that we can or should rescue them from their situation. So I think that's a part of the dilemma. You know, Ray was very tart in talking about foreign policy realism, this idea that we should be guided by our interests solely and not by our values. You know, I heard something quite critical in your tone. I just, you know, would caution that once we start driving our foreign policy with our values, it becomes a very difficult question to know when to stop. When the people that we're trying to help, whether it's Hong Kong or Syria or Lebanon, or I'll go down a long, long list, who hunger for the assistance we can give them and want more and more. And where do we draw that line? Where's the line that bounds the moral behavior, the moral intervention that's good, and the immoral intervention that's bad? And I think that's really the riddle of my lifetime, is thinking about when it goes wrong and when you need to hold on tight to values. But I wouldn't, Ray, just be dismissive of the idea that we have to be careful about values and we have to think about interests, that we should never get into wars except when we have no choice, that they're not things we do for values, they're the things we do for necessity.
Well, is modesty also a value? Modesty when it comes to understanding what you can plausibly or legitimately accomplish. Modesty when it comes to understanding your own rights and prerogatives as opposed to the rights and prerogatives of other people on the planet. I understand what you're saying about realism, and there may be a realism that can be applied in an idealistic way, I guess. In the case of Hong Kong, being very clear and saying to the world what we think about Hong Kong and doing something about it are two different things, I guess. In the case of the Trump administration, when things were starting to get really bad in Hong Kong, the United States redefined its trade relations with Hong Kong, changed some of the agreements that it made initially when its status moved from British Crown colony to special administrative province of the People's Republic of China. It was plausible, it was restrained, and also very clear about what the United States thought about what was going on in Hong Kong.
Yes, there, that's louder, certainly. When I think about cases like Hong Kong, I'm reminded of what people in the insurance industry call moral hazard. The idea that by promising to assist you, in the case of insurance, financially, you end up encouraging reckless behavior. And I think that the United States, at its best, trying to be moral, sometimes has been guilty of that we've encouraged people to take risks on the implicit promise that we stand with you, when in truth, the likelihood that the United States would or should go to war over Hong Kong is non-existent. And I can remember having some meetings with students in Hong Kong and just cautioning them. I've seen the story that you're living over and over. I've seen it in Egypt during the Arab Spring. I've seen it across the Middle East. I've seen it in Russia. And that, be careful when the time comes to make the deal that will give you more freedom, but not give you everything you want. That's the moment you need to not be so militant that you're prepared to take that deal. So sometimes, weirdly, this gets in the deep water, but sometimes, weirdly, the moral choice involves compromise.
Is our challenge heightened by the fact that among the nations of the world, we do talk broadly and frequently about values rather than interests? Do we give ourselves a greater challenge by being an overtly and publicly religious people?
So I think America's a very religious country, and I think our insistence on religious freedom and the sphere of spiritual life is a great strength of our country and something we should never give up. In my business, in our business of journalism, I think bearing witness to truth and justice and racial, economic dignity is crucial. It doesn't involve the use of force. It doesn't involve, and there may be risks to individual journalists, but we're not risking our country's, the lives of other Americans in doing that. Obviously, I think about Saudi Arabia, where my friend and colleague Jamal Khashoggi tried to be a voice for change and for good, and was murdered for it. And one thing that I really admire about the Post, where I work, is that we haven't given that up. If you read the Post, we're still insisting that there be accountability for that and for other things that involve human rights issues around the world. And so I think for us as private citizens, as journalists, there's unambiguously an obligation to keep faith with people. exactly what our country should do in pursuing those things is more complicated.
But when we talk to the world about when our leaders talk to the world about what they believe, when they talk to us about what they believe in order to gain office, does that oblige them to live by those values when they're actually running things once they win? Or if they assert values as a guide, religiously predicated values as a guide, are they obliged to follow those values when practicing statecraft? Or is it just part of the way that we appeal to voters to get them to vote for us?
Well, people shouldn't make promises they're not prepared to keep. They also shouldn't, write checks, in effect, that the American people are not, in the end, willing to cash. And people make promises that are unrealistic, and retreating from them when they have the reality of power, I think sometimes is appropriate. They never should have made the unrealistic promises in the first place. I think the role of morality in American foreign policy is, I think it's something I will struggle with as a journalist writing about this, the proper balance for the rest of my career. I've made some terrible mistakes in judgment in my own writing and commentary over the years. I had followed Iraq. I wrote a novel about Iraq as a kind of nation governed by torture, in effect. So when it came time to think about the Iraq War, I wrote some columns that supported the idea. There are no words I'd rather take back when I think about the consequences of that. So in my own life, I have to be honest that this is an iterative process. You keep trying to learn what's right and what's wrong, and be honest about when something that you thought made sense doesn't. I mean, so many of the things that we do are just the refusal to admit this isn't a good thing. People of good faith may have thought it was a good thing, but it's not. And we could save so many deaths, so many terrible consequences, I think, just by that more honest debate. But as you know, Ray, people are so afraid of, well, you said this, during the campaign, and now you said, it's like what you were talking about, like, should we attack people for reversing pledges they made during political campaigns? Sometimes no. We should probably say, you're right. You've learned from real life. That was not a realistic proposal you made.
I'm glad you mentioned Afghanistan, because the American project there went on for so long that it involved 4 different presidents. And it made me think about whether there should be, whether there can ever be, a values through line that binds successor administrations, whether there's a set of American ideas or ideals that other countries in the world, when looking at us over the long haul, can rely on, or whether approaches and ideas and proposals about the shape of the world only last as long as the person making them does. Can people make conclusions about whether America is to be trusted when way down the road a later president says, that was a bad idea, let's stop doing that, let's take another course?
So that's something that President Biden is struggling with as we speak in Europe. When I talk with European diplomats, they will say, yes, we can see that after those 4 years of Donald Trump, the country rejected him, voted in Biden as president. But we never thought it would happen before, and how can we be sure it won't happen again? That's, America is a country that most Europeans, I'd say most people around the world, never imagined they would see, that they would hear things like what they've heard from an American president or see scenes like what we saw on January 6th. So they ask, are you reliable? Are you dependable? And Biden is trying so hard, I think, to present that appearance of dependability. It's clearly not entirely convincing. So one new thing that's interesting is that countries that we would like to be our friends are basically saying, put it in writing. Get Congress in some way to sign on to this. We could talk, Ray, about the Cold War and NATO, but one of the stories of our lifetime is this long, often, very ambiguous struggle had, I would say, a good result. Soviet communism vanished. And NATO, this alliance where we pledged to go to war, we pledged to sacrifice, Washington, D.C. or Chicago to save Berlin, or not Berlin, but Frankfurt or something. And that pledge was credible. So I think other countries today, looking at a very uncertain America, wonder if there's some way they can bind us to commitments that will endure if Joe Biden or another Democrat isn't elected in 2024, that they can still have some confidence that we'll be there. And I think that's an interesting question, whether you can, write moral and sensible foreign policy permanently into the record. It's complicated.
I don't want to sort of set a mistaken tone. By my open, I was trying to be more provocative than dictatorial about my own view of how the last 100 years have gone. And I got to tell you, when I walk into a marketplace in Aswan and see the shaking hands inside the red, white, and blue shield, and see a bag of grain that says a gift of the people of the United States of America, when I go into a teeny tiny clinic in really deep rural Tanzania and see a sign inside the clinic door saying that this place is funded and paid for by PEPFAR, which is a project of the United States of America and saved millions of lives in sub-Saharan Africa, I get a little lift. I mean, that old cliche, your tax dollars at work. I also like to think that it's our values at work. A cynic can look and say, well, we're just trying to curry favor and be friends with people. Well, maybe, but that's our values at work. When we do those things, when we take the people's money and do those things with it. But I also see a lot of other things that go on in the world and say, is this my values at work? Is this my tax dollars at work? Are states obliged to do things out of necessity that people as individuals would find immoral? Is there a different yardstick? Do we calibrate that question in a different way because states are states and that's all there is to it?
Well, the morality of states is different from individual morality, but I wouldn't want to be pinned down because I haven't thought it through carefully enough to give a coherent answer, but I know that it's not identical, in part because the risks are so much greater. You can make decisions for yourself, even for your family, but to make them for 300 million people is different. I've had that experience also, Ray, of traveling and seeing the good that American programs, USAID, do sadly, you'd see a lot more weapons, in air bases and forward munitions dumps than you would food or medical assistance. I'll mention one thing that I'd be interested in your reaction to this and all of ours. We sometimes talk about soft power, and for me, the best illustration of that is personal. My family, on my father's side, is Armenian. So my great-grandfathers grew up in the Ottoman Empire. And they attended a missionary school. It was called Euphrates College in eastern Anatolia, very much like the American University in Beirut or the American University in Cairo. Protestant missionaries, typically from New England. People it's easy to kind of see as a face of neocolonialism and, arrogant white men, et cetera. But in the case of my family, they were the breadth of freedom. My great-grandfather translated Paradise Lost into Armenian. If you want to think of a noble, vain, lost goal. The power of that liberal culture of ours, with its spirit of inquiry, its passion for the sciences, the fact that it isn't corrupt, that at the American University in Beirut or in Euphrates College you couldn't bribe your way to getting an A, which really does distinguish it from neighboring institutions, was a huge gift. And in my many years now, since 1980, of traveling and writing about the Middle East, I'm always stunned by just how many people who were running countries, sometimes for ill, but often for good, were educated at American universities, were educated in these values that we have. And I sometimes think these days we're tongue-tied, reluctant to express, that tradition. But as I say, I know in my own life, the life of my family, how powerful it is. And whenever I travel abroad, I try to go to those universities and just speak to students because I think it helps keep the values that I believe in alive.
The great thing about that story is how neatly it fits into something that people have told me all over the world, that they make a distinction between America, Americans, and the American government. And your story, I think, is a very neat illustration of how that can work. I was in a bar in sub-Saharan Africa talking to a guy who just struck up a conversation. He heard my accent. He says, "Oh, you're American." I said, "Yeah." He told me that he had been to a Big Ten university and he learned animal husbandry. And this was a very useful thing. I said to him, "Well, that's great." And I said, "Well, gosh, this country really needs people who understand animal husbandry." He says, "No, but we're so short of college-educated people that I work at the Ministry of Finance." So I'll set that aside for a moment. But I was observing to him that I'd seen a lot of Chinese projects underway. As you know, China is very deeply involved in Africa and building infrastructure left and right. And he said to me in a sort of triumphant manner, and he says, "And they don't ask us any questions about internal bookkeeping, they don't demand any transparency, and they don't tell us any rules about how these programs should be administered." And it was a sort of so there moment because Americans are seen as meddlesome and intrusive. So I said, well, you know, you went to school in the Midwest, you understand the country pretty well. I said, you want to live in a world that's run under Chinese rules or American rules? And he laughed uproariously, clapped me on the back and said, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about, say no more. He understood that there was a difference between looking the other way at corruption and also being free to do what you want to do. There is I find a very fine-grained understanding of the difference between Americans as people, who are often seen with great affection, and America as a polity with a government that's often not as seen as sort of an optimistic, simple-minded giant that doesn't look where it steps. And I try to keep that tension in mind all the time when I'm talking to people in other parts of the world, because they really are very clear about the fact that the government in Washington is very different from the Americans they meet and interact with.
Well, I think you're right. That's a standard thing that every traveler hears. I love America. I love Americans. I just don't like your government. You could even hear that here in this country. As I think about our question, it's obviously how do we amplify the good and moral parts of our beliefs through the government, because this is about scale. We can do it through private charities, but you know, we want our government to reflect good values without being meddlers. There is something that people resent, even when we're meddling and lecturing people about good things, human rights, our values, that people just get sick of it. And you know, elections. I'm sorry, but people just sometimes get sick of that. I often have thought that rule of law in these countries where, you know, the worst thing many people face is just that their goods, the things that they created, will be stolen from them. It's just thoroughly corrupt. That we stand for the rule of law. You know, let's put democracy, let's put elections aside. The rule of law. And to the extent we can really mean that, it's one of the things I like about the Biden administration, is that it's putting a lot of stress on rules-based, standards-based, standard-setting bodies, not conceding to the Chinese or Russians, all these little UN groups that end up making a big difference. They're just, it's like a, you know, forgive me, a community meeting where, you know, if a person who stays until 11:30 gets, so often we just have left at 9, and the Chinese have ended up getting their person elected, setting the standard. So the Biden administration is fighting back aggressively on that. I think that's great. You know, again, the dilemma that you set, Ray, that I've been talking about, how do we think through the complicated moments where doing good becomes, you know, takes on more and more risks for ourselves and others. You know, something I know I get wrong every other time I write about it, but I'm trying to get it right.
Well, human rights is one of those areas where Americans are of multiple minds. I think it's fair to say there is a dismissal of leaders who put that front and center and then are forced to compromise at one, you know, or take off some of the hard edges of a policy down the road. That's seen as being soft, seen as being sentimental, seen as not being realistic. The people who assign to themselves the label of realists know that they have to do business with bad people and sometimes do things they wouldn't want to talk about publicly in order to get other stuff done. There's this swagger that comes from working in an almost value-free environment where it's instrumental, it's pragmatic, it's said to be done with only goals in mind, and you don't want to know about the means. let's just talk about the ends. You're better sitting at home in Chicago or Boston or Tallahassee. Just let us do this, and you'll see what happens at the end. And we saw that in the way that Jimmy Carter's been written about and talked about for decades since he left the Oval Office. We saw that in the early Bush years with the Vulcans, people who called themselves the Vulcans, Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, and led by George W. Bush. There's this pendulum swing where realists are celebrated and softies are dismissed. And then we realize, uh-oh, we didn't want to do that necessarily quite that extremely. And the pendulum swings back a little bit to a more modified version. I wonder if that expresses who we are broadly, that we are a mix of realists and softies, that we do want to be seen to be a force for good in the world and also be seen as pragmatic and effective and, if you'll excuse the term, ass kickers who get things done.
So my last thought about this, Ray, I see a microphone being taken to hopefully get your questions. The end of my first novel, called Agents of Innocence, a character says, apropos of the mess that developed in Lebanon, "You Americans want so much to do good in the world, but you don't have the stomach for it." Meaning that when you embark on these efforts, it's going to get tough, and it's going to get politically unpopular. I'm not talking about wars where you're killing people necessarily, just staying the course and commitments that you make. And historically, that's often been true. We don't have the stomach for it. Going gets tough, and we check out of town. One thing about the Cold War that impresses me, it's this big story of my life, is that America didn't tire or falter in the fundamentals of that. We got mighty confused about some of the, the morality of the commitments we made along the way, but we were steadfast, and I think that had a good outcome. So I'll end it there and wait for questions.
The mic is out there in the field.
Short answers, David. It seems to me that one area where we can practice our moral values is in immigration. By allowing people to immigrate here, we're not trying to solve the problems in their country. We're allowing them to come build their own life. The population density of the U.S. is about 36 per square kilometer. That of Haiti is more than 400. We have lots of resources. We like to hold on to them and protect them, but we could improve our immigration policy, make it more effective, more generous. I realize we do allow more immigrants than most of any of the other developed countries, but we still have a lot of potential there.
So I think you're right. We have a broken political system that doesn't seem to be able to solve problems that people care about. I'm hoping the next few days we'll have a counterexample with the passage of this big legislation. I don't think it's wrong for people to think that the United States, like any other country, should have a border, and that border should be meaningful and not porous. I don't think that that's wrong per se. But what the criteria should be for letting people across that border needs to be articulated clearly, and what happens to people who came across that border and are here, like the Dreamers, needs to be articulated clearly, and that's the job of a political system that's broken. So what do we do in that situation? I mean, is it best to just say, it's open season, come on ahead, folks? The burden of that for people in border states seems more than they're willing to pay. So it doesn't feel to me that that's the right answer, that it's even the moral answer. But there is an answer that takes account of what you're saying. We have such abundance in this country, we can sustain so many more people than we do. We need the labor of other people. So how do we get it right? And I'd love to live in a country where we had a debate about that, and then we had a policy, and people signed on to it. That's where I want to live. Where I live instead is like, it's just chaos, and people are furious on both sides, and that's just a little snapshot of what everybody in this room knows is our problem, is our downward spiral.
The United States supposedly was founded on freedom of religion, but then human rights is also important. So where should we come out on countries that have, for instance, Islam that relegates women to second-class status in a bunch of places? And that's one of the things I think that contributed to maybe us losing in Afghanistan. So where do you come out on the balance of that?
So, I think I want to be careful when talking about Islam and what Islam thinks and stands for, because I know in my own experience so many progressive Muslims whose values about women, about rights are very close to mine. That said, there has been a level of oppression of women in Muslim societies that I find unacceptable. The question is, what do you do about it? There are people who said that we should have kept our troops, some troops in Afghanistan, to keep faith with the women of Afghanistan, whose lives you can already see. I just read a few days ago that women are now being told, don't go to your jobs in Kabul government offices, and they've already been told, don't go to high school where you're going. So, we left them to that fate, you could argue. Again, my sense, for what it's worth, is that there is a modernizing trend in Islam. The idea that we're in this permanent reversion to the Middle Ages is wrong, even in Afghanistan. I mean, I've watched Afghanistan, the 20 years I've been going there, become an urbanized country where 70% of the people watch television, use the internet, have cell phones. And if the Taliban think that they can cram, this sort of oppressive, restrictive life down everybody's throats on a permanent basis, I don't believe it.
Thank you so much for a fantastic session. And Ray's observation about visiting countries and seeing a sign at a medical clinic or other raises a question for me, which is, what do you think about the sometimes putting development assistance sort of under the wing of our foreign policy? There is, and I just want to flag it, a book that just came out called The Enduring Struggle, History of the U.S. Agency for International Development and America's Uneasy Transformation of the World by John Norris. And it seems some countries keep it independent, and we seem to have woven it together, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this.
Should we be centering aid in our outreach to the rest of the world rather than other considerations?
So, USAID should be a much more important part of our foreign policy. Diplomacy, in its many manifestations, should be a much more important part of our foreign policy. We have militarized foreign policy. We thought that we could achieve political outcomes in the world through the use of military force, and we have that experiment, the results of that experiment are in. And we have the answer, and the answer is no. So if we want to be involved in the world to make a difference, we need to try, focus on the other aspects of power, as exemplified by USAID, exemplified by PEPFAR that Ray mentioned. 100 things. There's so many good things that are being done by NGOs and by government organizations. But I just would say that's where our power is going forward. It's in stuff like that. And we have the evidence.
Thank you both very much. We are out of time. Really, really appreciate it, David and Ray. Thank you.